The Gryffindor common room fire crackled with particular enthusiasm on this October evening, as if the castle itself approved of the mischief brewing in its warmest corner. Fred Weasley hunched over a piece of parchment that bore more doodles than transfiguration notes, his quill scratching out another failed attempt at McGonagall's assigned essay on animagus transformation theory. Beside him, his twin George had abandoned all pretense of homework entirely, instead prodding at a suspicious-looking purple sphere with the tip of his wand. "It's supposed to whistle," George muttered, squinting at the object as if concentration alone might make it perform. Zonko's catalogue said these new dung bombs have a delayed fuse with an auditory component. "Auditory component," Fred repeated, grinning without looking up. "You sound like Percy." "Take it back. Make me." The purple sphere chose that moment to emit not a whistle, but a concerning hiss. Both twins froze, their identical brown eyes widening in perfect synchronization, a look that had preceded disaster since they were old enough to toddle toward trouble. "George?" "Yes." "Fred?" "That doesn't sound like whistling." "No, Fred, it does not." The dung bomb detonated with a sound like a dragon's sneeze, flooding their corner of the common room with a putrid green smoke that smelled distinctly of rotten cabbage and burned hair. Third years scattered like startled owls, clutching their homework and coughing dramatically. Lee Jordan, their closest friend and frequent accomplice, tumbled backward off his chair in his haste to escape, sending his potions textbook skidding across the floor. "Honestly," Hermione Granger's voice cut through the chaos from across the room, where she sat with Harry and Ron. Even as a second year, her capacity for righteous indignation was formidable. "Some people are trying to study." Fred waved his wand in a complicated pattern, muttering "Ventus," and a gust of wind swept most of the smoke toward the portrait hole, where the fat lady shrieked in protest. George was already siphoning the remaining fumes into an empty inkwell with a spell they'd modified specifically for containing embarrassing evidence. "Sorry," they chorused, with identical expressions of exaggerated innocence that fooled absolutely no one. The portrait hole swung open just as the last wisps of smoke disappeared, and Professor McGonagall stepped through with the impeccable timing that suggested she possessed some sixth sense for Weasley twin-related emergencies. Her sharp eyes swept the common room, taking in the scattered students, the overturned furniture, and the twins frozen in position like rabbits spotted by a particularly stern fox. "Mr. Weasley," she said crisply. "Mr. Weasley." Her lips thinned into that expression that meant detention was imminent. "My office, now. Both of you." The walk to McGonagall's office was familiar enough that Fred's feet knew the way without a conscious thought. They'd made this journey enough times in 3 years to recognize which flagstones were slightly uneven, which portraits would offer sympathetic looks, and which suits of armor might clank ominously as they passed. Sir Cadogan raised his tiny sword in salute as they trudged by. "Brave lads, facing the dragon in her den. Not helping, Sir Cadogan," George muttered. McGonagall's office smelled of parchment and the faint lavender scent of the tea she kept in a tartan tin on her desk. The Transfiguration professor settled into her chair with the careful precision of someone preparing to deliver a lecture that had been given many times before, but must be repeated nonetheless. "Dung bombs," she said, the word itself sounding like an accusation. "In the common room, during study hours. The night before your transfiguration examination. It was an accident, Professor Fred offered. A scientific accident, George added, helpfully. We were conducting research into the properties of I'm not interested, McGonagall interrupted, though something flickered in her eyes that might have been reluctant amusement in your creative justifications. I'm interested in why two reasonably intelligent young men persist in squandering their magical education on pranks and explosions. Fred opened his mouth to respond with something clever, but McGonagall held up one hand. You both exceeds expectations in last year's examinations across nearly every subject. Professor Flitwick tells me your charms work is exemplary when you bother to apply yourselves. Even Professor Snape, and this pains me to admit, has noted that your potion brewing demonstrates genuine skill in combining ingredients for unexpected effects. The twins exchanged glances. They'd never heard McGonagall string together compliments about them before. It was deeply unsettling. So I must ask, their head of house continued, leaning forward slightly, why waste such potential on making your classmates' dormitories smell like troll dung? Why spend your evenings inventing new ways to disrupt rather than discover? The question hung in the air like the smoke had hung in the common room, persistent and impossible to ignore. Fred found himself actually thinking about it, which was unusual. Normally, their motivations seemed obvious, because it was funny, because they could, because the castle was too serious, and someone needed to remind everyone that magic could be joyful. But McGonagall was waiting, and she had that look that suggested she genuinely wanted an answer. Because people laugh, Fred said, finally. So, Ma'am, Professor George nodded. Everyone's always so worried about examinations and house points and doing everything properly. But when we set off a filibuster's firework in the Great Hall, even the Slytherins grin. For a moment, everything's just lighter. McGonagall studied them both with an expression that was difficult to read. Then she sighed, the sound somehow conveying both exasperation and something that might have been understanding. Detention, she said crisply. Tomorrow evening, polishing the trophy room. Without magic. However, she paused, and the twins braced themselves for whatever came next. I suggest that if you insist on pursuing pranks as a vocation, you at least pursue them with the same dedication you would give to any magical discipline. Half measures and sloppiness lead to accidents. Accidents lead to injury. Do you understand? They nodded, slightly confused about whether they'd just been scolded or given permission. Now get out of my office and study for tomorrow's examination. And if I find one more dung bomb in the Gryffindor common room this term, I will have you scrubbing cauldrons for Professor Snape until Christmas. They fled before she could change her mind or add further threats. Back in the common room, the incident had already achieved legendary status. First years whispered excitedly as they passed, and Lee Jordan had apparently spent their absence doing dramatic reenactments of the explosion, complete with exaggerated gagging sounds. How bad? Lee asked as they collapsed into the chairs by the fire, which had returned to its usual peaceful crackling. Trophy room, tomorrow night, no magic, Fred reported. But that's not the interesting bit, George said slowly, pulling out the piece of parchment covered in transfiguration notes, or rather, the margins covered in sketches of various joke items. Did you hear what McGonagall said? About applying ourselves to pranks like they were real magic. Fred leaned over to look at his twins' parchment, where George was now drawing careful diagrams. You thinking what I'm thinking, that we should actually try to invent something, not just set off things. We bought at Zonko's, but create something original. Lee Jordan scooted his chair closer, his dark eyes bright with interest, like what Fred grabbed a fresh piece of parchment, shoving his abandoned homework aside. The Transfiguration essay could wait. This felt important in a way that studying rarely did. Think about it. Everything we use, someone invented. The dung bomb, the filibuster's firework, those nose-biting teacups. Some witch or wizard sat down and figured out how to make those things work. So why couldn't we? George finished, already sketching. We know charms. We're decent at potions when Snape's not breathing down our necks. We understand how ingredients interact. Remember when we accidentally turned that sleeping draft purple and it started singing? Professor Snape, remembers Lee said solemnly. He brings it up at least once a month. But Fred was warming to the idea, feeling something spark in his chest that had nothing to do with accidental explosions and everything to do with possibility. What if we made something that people actually wanted? Not just pranks, but useful pranks. Things that could help students get out of situations they don't want to be in. George's quill scratched rapidly across the parchment. Like what? What would we even make? Well, Fred said, thinking back to last year, when he desperately wanted to avoid a history of magic examination. What about sweets that make you ill, but only temporarily? Just sick enough to visit Madame Pomfrey. Then you're fine. Lee laughed. Skiving snack boxes. My dad told me they tried to invent something like that when he was at school, but they could never get it to stop once it started. Derek Wilkins apparently had purple spots for 3 months. Exactly, George said, drawing what looked like a piece of candy with careful labels. What if we could control it, make it start and stop on command? The fire popped, sending up a shower of orange sparks that reflected in the windows, where rain had begun pattering against the glass. The common room was emptying as students headed to bed, but the twins and Lee remained, bent over their parchment like conspirators planning a heist. It would have to be 2-part, Fred mused, pulling the diagram toward himself and adding notes. 1 sweet to cause the illness, 1 to cure it, but you'd have to take them at the same time somehow. Otherwise, people would just take the first part and not have the cure. Magic could handle that, George said, confidently. Some kind of delayed activation charm. You eat the whole thing, the illness part works immediately, but the cure is locked inside with a timer. Lee was grinning now. You're actually serious about this? Why not? Fred shrugged, but his heart was beating faster, with something that felt suspiciously like genuine excitement. McGonagall basically told us we're wasting our potential. What if we used it for this instead? They worked until the fire burned low, and Lee's eyes started drooping. The parchment before them was covered in sketches, crossed out ideas, and arrows connecting various magical theories. Most of it was probably nonsense. Fred was honest enough to admit that. But some of it felt like it might actually work. As they finally climbed the stairs to their dormitory, where their roommates were already snoring, George paused on the landing. Fred, yeah. Do you really think we could do it? Invent something real. Fred looked at his twin, his mirror, his best friend and partner in every scheme since they were old enough to toddle. In the dim light, filtering up from the common room, George looked simultaneously doubtful and hopeful, an expression Fred suspected he was mirroring exactly. "I don't know," Fred admitted, "but I think we should try, because if we don't, we'll just be the blokes who set off stink bombs in the common room. And that's not really a legacy, is it?" George grinned. "Mum would be so proud. Mum would send us a howler every day for a month." "True. So we probably shouldn't tell her." They crept into the dormitory, careful not to wake their roommates, and Fred fell asleep with sketches of sweets dancing through his dreams, each one a possibility, each one a spark that might catch fire and become something more than just another prank, something that might actually matter. In her office, 3 floors below, Professor McGonagall finished marking papers and allowed herself a small smile. She'd seen that look before, in other students over the years, the moment when potential recognized itself and decided to reach for something more. Whether the Weasley twins would follow through remained to be seen, but she'd learned long ago that even the most unlikely students could surprise you. The castle settled into its nighttime rhythms, portraits dozing in their frames, suits of armor standing silent vigil, and in the Gryffindor Tower, 2 red-haired boys dreamed of making magic that could make people laugh. It was a small dream, perhaps, but all great things began small, with a spark, with an idea, with a decision to try something that might be impossible. And if there was anything the castle had learned in 1,000 years of teaching magic, it was that impossible was simply a challenge, waiting for the right wizard to prove it wrong. Winter settled over Hogwarts like a thick woolen blanket, transforming the castle into something from a fairy tale. Snow gathered on the windowsills in perfect drifts, icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers, and the lake froze solid enough that students could watch the giant squid creating strange shadows beneath the ice. The castle's fires burned warmer in response, as if the building itself was determined to keep its inhabitants comfortable. Fred and George had returned from the Christmas holidays, with their trunks unusually heavy. Not with textbooks, as their mother had hoped, but with ingredients borrowed from the kitchen garden shed and the Diagon Alley apothecary during a supposedly supervised shopping trip. Gillyweed that made one's fingers tingle, dried nettles that smelled of summer despite the winter cold, billywig stings carefully preserved in small glass vials, and a suspicious quantity of sugar quills that were definitely not for eating. The problem, as they quickly discovered, was finding somewhere to actually work. "Can't use the common room," George muttered one evening as they huddled in a corner, supposedly working on astronomy charts, but actually debating locations. "Too many people asking questions, and we can't exactly explain that we're trying to create sweets that induce vomiting." "The dormitory's worse," Fred agreed, keeping his voice low. "Kenneth Towler already told his mum we keep weird ingredients under our beds. If he catches us brewing something, we'll have McGonagall and Mum both descending on us like avenging angels." Lee Jordan, who had appointed himself their unofficial business partner, despite having contributed nothing but enthusiasm and a willingness to test products, tapped his quill against his teeth. "What about the dungeons?" "There are loads of empty classrooms down there, right next to Snape's office." Fred shook his head. "That's not optimism, that's a death wish." They'd spent 2 weeks searching, using the Marauders map that Fred and George had acquired from Filch's office during their first year, though they hadn't yet figured out how to make it work properly. Without it, they were reduced to wandering the castle during their free periods, opening random doors and hoping to find something suitable. Most of their discoveries were disappointments. Broom cupboards too small to work in, classrooms still in use by older students for study groups, or rooms that appeared empty but were clearly someone's territory, marked by the kind of magical residue that warned away intruders. It was during one of these explorations, on a particularly cold Saturday afternoon in January, when most students were in Hogsmeade, that they found it. The 7th floor was a maze of corridors that seemed to shift when you weren't looking, lined with portraits who gossiped more than the students, and tapestries depicting everything from medieval wizarding battles to someone's questionable interpretation of a unicorn. It had 6 legs and antlers. Fred and George had explored this area before, but never this particular corridor, a narrow passage behind a tapestry of Barnabas, the barmy, attempting to train trolls for the ballet. "This is ridiculous," George said, peering down the dim corridor. "No one comes down here. Look at the dust." Indeed, the floor was coated with a layer of undisturbed dust that made their footprints clearly visible in the wandlight. The corridor ended in what appeared to be a dead end, but there was a door, old, wooden, and so covered in grime that its original color was impossible to determine. Fred tried the handle. It turned. The room beyond was perfect. It was larger than they'd expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with high windows that let in pale winter light filtered through years of accumulated dirt. Desks were stacked haphazardly against one wall, their surfaces scarred by decades of carved initials and experimental spell damage. Broken quills littered the floor alongside scattered parchment so old it crumbled at a touch. A blackboard covered one wall, still bearing the faint chalk marks of some long-ago lesson on the properties of moonstone. "It's abandoned," George breathed, stepping inside carefully as if sudden movement might make the room disappear. Completely abandoned. Fred was already moving, running his fingers along the dusty windowsill and peering into the corners. No portraits to spy on us, no paintings to report to the staff. It's far enough from everything that no one would hear minor explosions or smell questionable potions, George finished, grinning. "Fred, this is it. This is perfect." They spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, using every household charm they could remember from watching their mother at the Burrow. Scourgify removed years of grime from the windows, letting in clear winter light that revealed just how much dust had accumulated. They vanished the broken furniture and cleared the debris, creating an open space that felt full of possibility. By the time the sun was setting, painting the walls orange and gold, they had created something that looked almost intentional. A clear workspace in the center, the blackboard cleaned and ready for notes, the windows sparkling. They'd even managed to repair 2 of the desks, which now stood against the far wall like proper workbenches. "We need to mark it as ours," Fred said, studying their handiwork. "Something so that if anyone else stumbles across it, they know this is claimed territory." George pulled out his wand and pointed it at the door. "How about a simple charm? Nothing obvious from the outside, but something that would warn us if someone tries to enter." They spent 20 minutes experimenting before settling on a charm that would make the door handle uncomfortably warm to anyone except them. Not hot enough to burn, but unpleasant enough to discourage curiosity. It was subtle magic, the kind that might seem like natural castle weirdness rather than deliberate protection. Right then, Fred said, surveying their new workshop with satisfaction. Tomorrow, we start properly. But tomorrow was Sunday, and Sunday meant they were expected at breakfast, at lunch, and generally to be visible enough that no one worried about what the Weasley twins might be plotting. It wasn't until Monday evening, after a particularly tedious history of magic lesson, that they managed to return to the 7th floor corridor with their bags full of ingredients and determination. Lee had promised to stand watch near the tapestry, providing warning if any professors approached, though he'd complained bitterly about missing the actual exciting part. "You'll get your turn," George promised him. "Once we've made something that won't permanently disfigure you." "So encouraging," Lee muttered, but he took up his position with a book on defensive spells and a bag of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Inside the workshop, Fred and George laid out their supplies with the careful precision usually reserved for examination practical work. Sugar base for the candy shell, carefully measured. Billywig stings for the giddy, light-headed feeling that might pass for illness. Bulbadox powder to induce boils, though they'd need just a trace amount, and a delayed action mechanism to ensure the boils appeared only temporarily. "We start with nosebleed nougat," Fred decided, consulting the notes they'd been refining since October. "It's the simplest in theory. Blood looks dramatic, but nosebleeds are relatively harmless. Madame Pomfrey can stop them in seconds if something goes wrong." "Comforting," George said dryly, but he was already heating a small cauldron with a careful flame charm. "So we need something to thin the blood near the surface of the nasal passages, but only temporarily, and it needs to be contained in candy that tastes good enough that people will actually want to eat it." They worked for 2 hours, trying different combinations and proportions. The first attempt produced candy that tasted like feet and did absolutely nothing. The second attempt tasted better, but made George's ears turn purple for 15 minutes. Interesting, but not the desired effect. The third attempt seemed promising until Fred tested a tiny piece and immediately developed hiccups that sounded like a diseased hippogriff. "This is harder than I thought," Fred admitted, vanishing his 6th batch of failed candy with a frustrated flick of his wand. George was staring at his notes, quill tapping against his chin in a gesture that made him look startlingly like Percy. "I think we're approaching it wrong. We're trying to make the candy do everything, 'cause the illness and control it. What if we separate the functions entirely?" "How do you mean?" "2 different sweets, 2 different formulas. One side causes the nosebleed. The other side stops it. You bite down on one end, then a few minutes later, you bite down on the other end." George was sketching rapidly now, drawing what looked like a piece of nougat with a clear line down the middle. "Different colors, so you know which is which. Orange for the bleeding, purple for the cure." Fred leaned over the diagram, following his brother's logic. "But how do you keep people from just taking the orange side and selling the purple side? Or vice versa?" "Magic," George said simply. "We charm them to work as a pair. If you eat the orange without the purple, it warns you. Maybe makes your tongue tingle. And if you try to eat the purple first, it just tastes like normal candy. It only activates if you've taken the orange within a certain time frame. It was brilliant, actually. Simple enough to be achievable, complex enough to require real skill. Fred felt that spark again, the one that had ignited in McGonagall's office and had been smouldering ever since. Let's try it. They worked late into the night, far past when they should have returned to the common room. Lee had long since abandoned his watch, trusting that the twins would be sensible enough to avoid getting caught. A trust that was somewhat misplaced, but appreciated nonetheless. The workshop filled with the smell of brewing candy, sugar caramelizing, herbs releasing their properties when heated, the sharp tang of magical ingredients combining in ways that weren't found in any textbook. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only twins could manage, where each knew what the other needed before they asked. "Try this," George said finally, offering Fred a piece of nougat that was distinctly two-toned. Bright orange on one half, deep purple on the other. Fred examined it carefully. The division between the colors was clear, the texture looked right, and it smelled like butterscotch with an underlying hint of something medicinal. He bit down on the orange side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt a tickling sensation in his nose, followed by a warm trickle. He touched his upper lip and his fingers came away red. "It's working," he said, his voice slightly nasally. "How long?" George was watching his enchanted watch, counting under his breath. 30 seconds. Now try the purple." Fred bit down on the other half of the nougat. The bleeding stopped immediately, so quickly that he wondered if it had happened at all. He probed his nose carefully, but there was no pain, no residual discomfort, just the memory of blood and the faint taste of butterscotch. "George," he said slowly, "I think we've actually done it." His twin was grinning, the expression transforming his face into something wild and triumphant. "We've done it. We've actually invented something." They spent another hour testing, refining the timing, adjusting the flavors until the nougat tasted genuinely pleasant rather than medicinal. By the time they finally cleaned up and extinguished the lights, leaving their workshop under cover of darkness, they had produced 5 perfect pieces of nosebleed nougat, each one wrapped carefully in parchment and tucked into Fred's pocket like precious jewels. The castle was silent as they navigated back to Gryffindor Tower, using wand light to avoid the trick stairs and checking around corners for Filch or his odious cat. The fat lady was snoring gently in her frame, and they had to wake her with gentle whispers before she swung aside to admit them. The common room was empty except for the dying fire, which flared briefly in greeting as they entered. They collapsed into their usual chairs, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. "We should test it properly," George said after a moment. "Make sure it works on other people, not just us." "Lee," Fred agreed. "Tomorrow. We'll tell him it's ready." But as they sat there in the firelight, Fred found himself thinking beyond just nosebleed nougat. If they could make this work, what else could they create? Puking pastilles for upset stomachs, fainting fancies for dramatic exits, fever fudge for avoiding examinations. An entire range of sweets designed to help students escape whatever they needed to escape, then return to normal as if nothing had happened. "George? What if this actually became something? Not just us messing about, but something real, something we could sell." George turned to look at him, the firelight casting strange shadows across his face. You mean like a business? Why not? People would buy these. You know they would. And we could make other things too. Joke wands, trick quills, things that make people laugh. We're good at that. We're 14, George pointed out, but his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. We'd need money, a location, permission. We've got years before we need to worry about that, Fred interrupted. But we could start now. Perfect the products, build up a stock, figure out what works and what doesn't. Then when we're old enough, when we've finished school. He trailed off, but the idea hung between them, like a golden snitch waiting to be caught. It seemed impossible, audacious, the kind of dream that responsible people would laugh at. But the Weasley twins had never been particularly interested in responsibility. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, George said suddenly. What? That's what we call it. Our shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. He was grinning now, that mad grin that usually preceded their best and worst ideas. It has a ring to it. Fred tested the name in his mind, imagining it painted on a shop window in Diagon Alley, imagining shelves full of their inventions, imagining people laughing as they explored everything he and George had created. It seemed so distant, so impossible, but somehow also inevitable, as if they were simply discovering a future that was already waiting for them. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah, it does. They sat there until the fire burned down to embers, neither speaking, both dreaming. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the grounds in fresh white silence. The castle creaked and settled around them, and somewhere in its ancient stones, magic hummed with approval. In their pocket, 5 pieces of nosebleed nougat waited for their debut. It wasn't much, just candy that made you bleed briefly and then stopped. But it was theirs, created from scratch through trial and error and stubborn refusal to give up. It was proof that they could make something real, something that worked. It was, though they didn't quite realize it yet, the first step on a path that would lead them far beyond these castle walls, beyond what anyone expected of them, into a future bright with color and laughter and magic of their own making. But that was still to come. For now, they had a workshop, a working prototype, and a dream that felt just close enough to touch. Spring arrived at Hogwarts with the subtlety of a rampaging troll, transforming the grounds from frozen wasteland to muddy chaos practically overnight. The snow melted into rushing streams that carved new paths down the hillsides. The lake thawed with great cracking sounds that echoed across the valley, and the forbidden forest erupted in shades of green that seemed almost aggressive in their vibrancy. It should have been a time of optimism, of new beginnings. Instead, Fred Weasley felt like he was drowning. OWLs in 8 weeks, Percy announced at breakfast for what must have been the 1000th time, his prefect badge gleaming as he pointed his fork at his younger brothers with the air of someone delivering prophecy. Ordinary wizarding levels, the most important examinations of your academic career. Thus far, they determine your entire future. Thank you, Percy, Fred said, through gritted teeth, pushing his porridge around his bowl. We're aware. Are you? Percy's eyes narrowed behind his horn-rimmed glasses. Because I've seen you sneaking off at odd hours, and I've heard rumors about strange smells coming from the 7th floor. If you're wasting time on pranks when you should be studying. We're not wasting time. George interrupted, his tone sharper than usual. Neither of them had slept much lately, caught between the demands of examination preparation and the pull of their workshop, where 3 months of near constant work had produced a range of products that actually, genuinely worked. The nosebleed nougat had been perfected back in February. Since then, they'd developed working prototypes of puking pastilles, distinctly unpleasant to test but effective. Fainting fancies, which required very careful calibration to avoid actual unconsciousness, and a new product called fever fudge that raised one's temperature just enough to be sent to the hospital wing. Lee Jordan had been their primary test subject, though he'd started charging them in chocolate frogs after the puking pastille incident that had resulted in him missing dinner. A few trusted Gryffindors had also sampled their wares, always voluntarily, always with the purple cure half kept ready. Word was spreading quietly through the house that the Weasley twins had something special brewing. But success in their workshop hadn't translated to success in their studies. Fred's transfiguration essay on cross-species transformation was 3 days overdue. His potions homework existed only as vague intentions and guilt. Herbology, charms, defense against the dark arts. Every subject demanded attention he didn't have, time he'd already spent in the 7th floor corridor watching cauldrons bubble and candy crystallize. "Mum's going to murder us," George muttered that evening as they sat in the common room, surrounded by textbooks they weren't reading and notes they couldn't focus on. "If we fail OWLs, she'll actually murder us and use our bodies as garden fertilizer." Fred knew he was right. Molly Weasley had specific expectations for her children, and fails all examinations due to obsession with joke candy was not among them. Bill had been head boy. Charlie had been a prefect and Quidditch captain. Percy was on track to collect more OWLs than anyone in living memory. Even Ron, only a 3rd year, was managing decent marks. The twins were supposed to be the clever ones, the ones who could coast through on natural ability and last-minute cramming. Except natural ability only carried you so far, and they'd spent all their cramming time inventing new ways to fake illness. "We'll study," Fred said without conviction. "We'll focus. We have 8 weeks. That's plenty of time." It wasn't plenty of time. 8 weeks evaporated like morning mist as they struggled to balance everything at once. They studied, genuinely studied, forcing themselves to memorize potion ingredients and practice wand movements. But their hearts weren't in it, and their minds kept drifting to the workshop, to the new projects they'd planned, to the trick ones they'd been theorizing about but hadn't had time to attempt. The real disaster came on a Tuesday in late April, during what should have been a simple potions practical. Professor Snape had assigned them Wit Sharpening Potion, a relatively straightforward NEWT level brew that required precision but nothing extraordinary. Fred and George worked at their usual table in the dungeons, where the air was thick with competing scents of various ingredients, and the temperature never quite felt warm enough. "Scarab beetles," George muttered, consulting their textbook. "Crushed, not diced. 4 measures." Fred was grinding the beetles in their mortar, but his mind was elsewhere, specifically on the problem of trick wands. They'd acquired several cheap wands from a second-hand shop in Hogsmeade, and the theory was simple: charm them to malfunction amusingly at the crucial moment. But the magic was delicate. Too heavy-handed, and the wand wouldn't work at all. Too subtle, and the trick wouldn't activate. He'd been mentally working through the charm structure when George nudged him. Fred, the Beatles. That's way more than 4 measures. Fred looked down at the mortar. His twin was right. He'd ground enough scarab beetles for 3 potions, maybe 4. Swearing under his breath, he tried to scrape the excess back into their ingredient jar, but some had already fallen into the cauldron, where their potion was bubbling a promising silver blue. "It'll be fine," he said, more hope than certainty. "We'll just adjust the ginger root to compensate." They shouldn't have adjusted the ginger root. For 10 minutes, everything seemed acceptable. Their potion maintained its silver color, the consistency looked right, and the steam rising from it smelled appropriately sharp and clean. Fred was just beginning to relax when George grabbed his arm. "Fred, why is it turning orange?" The potion was indeed turning orange, a bright pumpkin shade that definitely wasn't mentioned anywhere in the textbook. As they watched in horror, it began bubbling more vigorously, the color deepening to red, then to a concerning purple. "Sir," George called out, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "Professor Snape, I think our potion—" The cauldron exploded. It wasn't a massive explosion, nothing that would damage the dungeons or injure anyone seriously. But it was loud, and it was messy, and it sent purple sludge across half the classroom, coating the stone walls, the nearest student desks, and, most unfortunately, the front of Professor Snape's robes. The dungeon fell silent, except for the sound of purple goo dripping onto the floor. Snape stood motionless, purple sludge sliding down his black robes in slow, thick rivulets. His expression was beyond fury, beyond rage. It had achieved a kind of transcendent coldness that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "Out," he said, his voice soft and deadly. "Both of you. Headmaster's office. Now." The walk to Dumbledore's office was worse than the one to McGonagall's had been back in October. That had felt like a routine detention, something familiar and manageable. This felt final, catastrophic, like watching a tower collapse and being powerless to stop it. The gargoyle guarding the entrance to Dumbledore's office jumped aside at Snape's snarled password, and they ascended the spiral staircase with legs that felt like lead. The office was quiet, filled with sleeping portraits of former headmasters and the gentle whirring of silver instruments whose purposes Fred had never understood. Fawkes the Phoenix watched them from his perch with ancient, sympathetic eyes. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, his expression grave as Snape delivered his report. When the potions master finished, purple goo still clinging to his robes, despite several cleaning charms, the headmaster was silent for a long moment. "Mr. Weasley," he said finally, looking at Fred. "Mr. Weasley," with a glance at George. "This is not the first incident this term. Professor McGonagall has reported several instances of distraction and incomplete homework. Professor Flitwick notes that while your practical charms work remains excellent, your theoretical knowledge has become concerningly spotty. And now Professor Snape informs me that you've destroyed a cauldron through what appears to be simple carelessness." "It was an accident, sir," Fred tried. "We miscalculated." "You were distracted," Snape cut in, his voice like acid. "I observed you both throughout the practical. Neither was paying proper attention. Your minds were clearly elsewhere." Dumbledore held up one hand, and Snape fell silent. though his expression remained thunderous. "The question I must ask," the headmaster continued, his blue eyes penetrating in that way that made Fred feel like every secret was laid bare, "is whether you are capable of taking your OWL examinations seriously. These tests, as I'm sure you're aware, determine your future course of study, and to some extent, your career options in the wizarding world." Fred felt George stiffen beside him. Their future? Right. The one where they opened a joke shop and sold magical pranks. The dream that had seemed so clear and possible in the firelight of the common room, but now felt childish and stupid in the face of actual authority. "We'll do better, sir," George said, and Fred heard the defeat in his voice. "We'll focus on our studies. We promise." "See that you do," Dumbledore said, though something in his expression suggested disappointment rather than anger. "You're both dismissed. I expect Professor Snape will assign appropriate detention." Appropriate detention turned out to be 2 weeks of scrubbing cauldrons in the dungeons every evening, without magic, under Snape's coldly watchful eye. 2 weeks when they couldn't work in their workshop, couldn't develop new products, couldn't do anything but scrub encrusted potion residue and reflect on their failures. But worse than the detention was the letter that arrived 3 days later. The howler came at breakfast, as they always did, designed for maximum humiliation and audience. Fred saw the red envelope before it reached their section of the Gryffindor table, recognized his mother's handwriting, and felt his stomach drop through the floor. George grabbed for it, but Fred was faster, breaking the seal and letting their mother's magnified voice explode across the great hall. "Fred and George Weasley, I have received a letter from Professor Dumbledore informing me that you nearly got yourselves expelled. Expelled? Do you have any idea how disappointed I am? How could you be so irresponsible? Your father and I did not send you to Hogwarts to waste your education on pranks and nonsense. You will focus on your examinations. You will achieve acceptable marks, or so help me. I will bring you home and you will spend the summer denoming the garden every single day until you learn the value of—" The howler tore itself into pieces, the last few words echoing around the suddenly silent great hall. Every eye was on them. First years stared openly. The Slytherin table was smirking. Even the ghosts had paused in their drifting to observe the spectacle. Fred felt his face burning red, not with embarrassment, but with shame. Real, genuine shame that sat in his chest like a stone. Across the staff table, Professor McGonagall looked sad rather than angry. Professor Flitwick seemed concerned. Even Dumbledore's expression was sympathetic, which somehow made everything worse. Percy was shaking his head, his expression one of profound disappointment, mixed with satisfaction at being proven right. Ron looked uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to his brothers and recognition that they genuinely messed up this time. Fred and George left the Great Hall without finishing their breakfast, without speaking to anyone, walking through the castle in numb silence until they found themselves in an empty corridor near the Charms classroom. "We're idiots," George said finally, his voice hollow. "Complete idiots," Fred agreed. They stood there for a long moment, the reality of their situation settling over them like heavy fog. They'd been so focused on their dream, on building something that mattered to them, that they'd forgotten about everything else. Their mother's expectations, their professor's concern. the basic responsibility of actually learning what they were supposed to learn. "What do we do?" George asked. Fred thought about their workshop, about the products they'd created, about the dream of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes that had burned so bright. He thought about his mother's voice, magnified and furious. He thought about Dumbledore's disappointed eyes. "We study," he said quietly. "We actually properly study. We pass these OWLs or Mum really will kill us." And the workshop. Fred felt something tear in his chest, but he forced the words out. "We can't. Not until after examinations. We have to prove we're serious about school, even if—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Even if their hearts weren't in it. Even if memorizing potion ingredients felt pointless when they could be creating something new. Even if every hour spent on homework felt like an hour stolen from their real work." "Right," George said, and there was an edge of bitterness in his voice that matched what Fred was feeling. "We'll be good little students. We'll make Mum proud." They walked back to Gryffindor Tower in silence, past their 7th floor corridor without even glancing at the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy. That night, they opened their textbooks and actually read them, forcing information into their brains through sheer stubborn determination. But as Fred stared at a diagram of proper wand movements for vanishing spells, all he could see was the workshop they were abandoning. The products half finished, the dreams put on hold. For the first time since they'd started this mad project, he wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. If maybe they really were just troublemakers who should focus on becoming respectable, pass their examinations, get respectable jobs at respectable places, and forget about making people laugh for a living. Outside, spring rain began to fall, and the castle settled into its evening rhythms. In a dusty corridor on the 7th floor, a workshop stood empty and unused, its cauldrons cold, its windows dark. The dream wasn't dead, but it was sleeping, waiting to see if they'd have the courage to wake it again. September arrived at Hogwarts with the crisp certainty of new beginnings. The Hogwarts Express had delivered its cargo of students, first years wide-eyed and nervous, older students greeting friends with elaborate hugs and loud exclamations. The sorting had placed new students into houses with the hat's usual cryptic commentary. The feast had been consumed with appropriate enthusiasm, and now the castle settled into the comfortable rhythm of a new term. Fred and George Weasley returned as 6 years, with 7 OWLs each. Not the 12 that Percy had collected, but respectable enough that their mother had actually smiled when the results arrived. Exceeds expectations in charms, transfiguration, and defense against the dark arts. Acceptable in everything else except history of magic, which they'd both spectacularly failed and refused to feel guilty about. More importantly, they returned with determination. The summer had been torturous in its own way. Their mother had kept them busy with chores and character-building activities that mostly involved de-gnoming the garden and repairing the chicken coop. But in the evenings, after everyone else had gone to bed, they'd sat in their rooms sketching plans and refining formulas, keeping their voices low so Percy wouldn't overhear and report them. They'd learned from their mistakes. Balance was key. They couldn't abandon their studies entirely. Their OWL results had proven that much. But they also couldn't abandon the dream that had taken root in that dusty workshop, the vision of creating something that mattered. "This year," Fred said on their first night back, lying in his four-poster while his roommates snored around them, "we do it properly. We keep up with homework. We don't explode any more cauldrons. And we actually finish what we started." "Agreed," George whispered back. "But first, we reclaim the workshop." The 7th floor corridor was exactly as they'd left it, the tapestry of Barnabas, the Barmy still depicting trolls in tutus with optimistic determination. The door to their workshop opened at their touch, the warming charm they'd placed on the handle recognizing them instantly. Inside, dust had settled over everything like a grey blanket. Their cauldrons sat cold and empty. The blackboard still bore their last chalk calculations from April. Jars of ingredients lined the shelves, some still viable, others that would need replacing. But the space was still theirs, still waiting. They spent the first week of term cleaning and restocking, being careful to maintain their coursework alongside the preparations. Fred found himself actually reading his potions textbook this time, not because Snape demanded it, but because understanding the theory helped him understand why their skiving snack boxes worked the way they did. George paid attention in charms with new focus, recognizing that every spell Flitwick taught them was a tool they could adapt for their own purposes. It was different now, approaching their education with intention rather than obligation. Magic wasn't just something they had to learn. It was something they could use to build the future they wanted. "Right then," Fred said on a Saturday evening in late September, laying out their notes on the workshop table. "We have working prototypes of nosebleed nougat, puking pastilles, and fainting fancies. But they're not perfect. The nougat works brilliantly. The other two are inconsistent." George was reorganizing their ingredient jars, checking expiration dates, and making a list of what they'd need from the next Hogsmeade weekend. "The puking pastilles are too aggressive. Remember when Lee was sick for 2 hours instead of 20 minutes? Hard to forget," Fred muttered. "He still flinches when we offer him candy." They'd been working for 3 hours when the breakthrough happened, though at the time, it seemed like just another failed experiment. George was attempting to refine the fever fudge formula, trying to find the exact balance that would raise body temperature convincingly without being dangerous. The fudge had to be strong enough to fool Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic charms, but gentle enough not to cause actual harm. "The problem," George said, stirring his cauldron with careful precision, "is that we're treating this like a potion. We add ingredients, we heat them, we hope for the best, but we're not making potions. We're making candy that contains potions. Two different things." Fred looked up from his own work, where he was attempting to improve the texture of their nosebleed nougat. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. When you brew a sleeping draught, all the ingredients work together in one solution. But our skiving snack boxes are two separate parts, the illness half and the cure half, that have to work in sequence but not interfere with each other." George abandoned his stirring and grabbed a piece of chalk, sketching rapidly on their blackboard. "We've been trying to mix everything together and then separate it. What if we reverse that? Brew two completely separate preparations, one for illness, one for cure, and then combine them only at the final candy-making stage." Fred moved to the blackboard, studying George's diagram. His twin had drawn 2 cauldrons, 2 separate formulas, with arrows indicating they'd only merged during the crystallization process when the candy actually formed. That's actually brilliant, Fred said slowly. We could control each half independently, perfect them separately, and the magic binding them together would be simpler because we're not fighting ingredient interference. They stared at each other, the same wild grin spreading across both faces simultaneously. We've been doing it backward, George said. We've been doing it completely backward, Fred agreed. They worked through the night, forgetting about sleep, forgetting about everything except the possibilities that had just opened before them. They started fresh with the fever fudge, brewing the temperature-raising component in one cauldron and the neutralizing component in another. The first cauldron contained ginger root for warmth, powdered horn of bicorn for endurance, and a trace amount of salamander blood, carefully calibrated to create heat without burning. The second cauldron was cooling ingredients, peppermint oil, crushed moonstone, and a stabilizing agent made from unicorn hair that George had acquired through means he refused to explain. They let both preparations simmer separately, perfecting each one until the colors were right. Bright orange for the fever-inducing half, cool blue for the cure. Then came the delicate part, combining them in melted sugar at exactly the right temperature, speaking the binding charm that would keep them separate, but linked until consumed. Figurare duplex, George murmured, his wand tracing careful patterns over the candy mixture. Sanere post nocere. The Latin roughly translated to form as two, and heal after harm. Not traditional spell words, but ones they created themselves after consulting every book on magical theory they could find. Traditional magic was useful, but their work required innovation. The fudge crystallized beautifully, forming perfect squares that were distinctly two-toned. Vibrant orange swirled with pale blue in patterns that looked almost artistic. Fred picked up one piece, examining it carefully. I'll test it. Fred, we have to know if it works. And if something goes wrong, you can get me to the hospital wing. He bit down on the orange section before George could argue further. The effect was immediate and precisely controlled. Fred felt warmth spread through his body, not uncomfortable, but definitely present. He touched his forehead. It was hot, fever hot, the kind of temperature that would definitely warrant a visit to Madame Pomfrey. George was timing it with his watch. 30 seconds. How do you feel? Warm, convincingly ill, not actually sick. Fred waited another 30 seconds, feeling the fever maintain its steady intensity, then bit down on the blue section. The cooling effect was instant and blissful, like diving into a mountain stream on a summer day. The fever disappeared completely, leaving him feeling perfectly normal. Better than normal, actually, slightly refreshed. George, Fred said quietly. It worked. It actually worked exactly as intended. His twin was grinning so wide, it looked painful. We did it. We figured out the formula. They spent the rest of the night reproducing the success, making batch after batch of fever fudge to ensure it wasn't a fluke. Each piece worked perfectly, the timing consistent, the effects precisely controlled. By the time dawn light started filtering through their grimy windows, they had 40 pieces of perfect fever fudge lined up on their workbench. But more importantly, they had the key to fixing everything else. Over the next 3 weeks, they applied their new understanding to the puking pastilles and fainting fancies. Separate the components, perfect them individually, then combine them only at the final stage. It was more work, required more precision, but the results were undeniable. The puking pastilles went from accidentally poisonous to reliable and safe. The illness half-induced nausea and vomiting that was unpleasant but controlled. The cure half-settled everything instantly, leaving no residual queasiness. The fainting fancies were trickier. Unconsciousness was harder to control than temperature or nausea. But by adjusting the dosage and adding a gentle sedative component rather than a knockout charm, they created faints that looked dramatic but were actually just deep, brief sleeps. They tested everything themselves first, then on Lee Jordan, who had forgiven them over the summer and was now their most enthusiastic supporter. Then, carefully, they began offering samples to trusted Gryffindors. "Just remember," Fred told a fourth year named Natalie MacDonald, handing her a piece of fever fudge. "Orange first for the fever, blue when you want it to stop. Don't take them more than an hour apart, and definitely don't try to sell the halves separately. They're magically bound and won't work right if separated." Natalie had a divination examination she wanted to avoid. She took the fudge gratefully, promising 2 galleons if it worked. It worked perfectly. She missed divination with a convincing fever, spent 20 minutes in the hospital wing being fussed over by Madame Pomfrey, then took the blue half and returned to normal. The 2 galleons appeared in Fred's bag the next day, wrapped in a note that said simply, "Brilliant. Got more?" Word spread through Gryffindor like fiend fire through dry timber. Students approached them in the common room, in the corridors between classes, even in the library when Madame Pince wasn't watching. They wanted fever fudge for examinations, nosebleed nougat for getting out of boring lessons, puking pastilles for avoiding detentions. The twins were careful about who they sold to. No first years, too risky. No one who seemed like they might tell a professor. And absolutely no one who didn't understand that these were tools for temporary escape, not actual medical problems. By October, they had a steady stream of customers and a growing pile of galleons hidden in a sock under Fred's mattress. More importantly, they had products that actually worked consistently and safely. "We should expand the range," George said one evening in the workshop, counting out another successful batch of nosebleed nougat. "We've got the skiving snack boxes down. What else could we make?" Fred had been thinking about this. Trick wands, remember? We talked about them last year, but never had the skill. Now, though, they'd learned so much in the past months, not just about potion making and candy crafting, but about the fundamental principles of magical innovation. How to test safely, how to refine iteratively, how to combine traditional magic with creative thinking. Trick wands would be different from the snack boxes, more charms-based than potions-based, but the underlying philosophy was the same. Take something ordinary, add a magical twist, make it entertaining but safe. They started researching in earnest, consulting books on wand lore in the library, and paying careful attention in charms lessons. Flitwick, noticing their renewed interest, seemed pleased and offered extra guidance on complex charm work, never suspecting it was being applied to turning wands into rubber chickens. The first successful trick wand took 6 weeks to create. They'd purchased a cheap wand from a second-hand shop in Hogsmeade. Holly and unicorn hair badly matched to any wizard, and spent hours carefully layering transformation charms that would activate at random intervals. The key was making it subtle enough that the wand would work normally most of the time. No one would buy a wand that never functioned. But at unpredictable moments, perhaps during a particularly dramatic spell, it would transform briefly into something ridiculous. Before returning to normal, Fred tested it by attempting a simple levitation charm on a quill. The wand worked fine. He tried again. Still fine. On the third attempt, just as he said, Wingardium Leviosa, the wand turned into a rubber parrot that squawked indignantly. George laughed so hard, he nearly fell off his stool. That's perfect. Did you see your face? They made 12 trick wands before winter break, each one slightly different. Some turned into rubber chickens, others into tin mice or licorice wands or bouquets of flowers. The transformations lasted only a few seconds, just long enough to be hilarious without being frustrating. These sold even faster than the snack boxes. Everyone wanted to give one to a friend as a prank, or to use themselves during a lesson they found particularly tedious. 2 galleons per wand, and they could barely keep up with demand. By December, the sock under Fred's mattress was uncomfortably full of galleons. They counted it one evening in the dormitory while their roommates were at dinner. 63 galleons, George said, stacking the coins carefully. 63 galleons from 3 months of sales. Fred stared at the pile of gold, something swelling in his chest that felt like hope mixed with possibility. George, this is real money. Not just pocket change, actual money. We'd need a lot more to open a shop, George pointed out. Ever practical. Rent in Diagon Alley alone would be hundreds, and we'd need stock, fixtures, permits. But it's proof, Fred interrupted. Proof that people want what we're making. Proof that this could actually work as a business. They sat there in the empty dormitory, surrounded by the fruits of months of work. Jars of skiving snack boxes, trick wands waiting to be distributed, notebooks full of ideas for new products. The workshop on the 7th floor had transformed from a dusty, abandoned classroom into a real laboratory, a real business in miniature. We're actually doing it, George said softly. We're actually building something. Fred nodded, unable to quite articulate the feeling. They'd faced setbacks, the exploding cauldron, their mother's disappointment, the realization that dreams required sacrifice and balance. But they'd pushed through, learned from their mistakes, and created something that mattered. The skiving snack boxes weren't just pranks. They were freedom, in candy form, the ability to escape situations that felt unbearable, to take control of one's own time and choices. The trick wands brought laughter to a castle that often felt too serious, too focused on examinations and expectations. They were making magic that made people happy, and people were willing to pay for happiness. Outside, snow began to fall over Hogwarts, covering the grounds in pristine white. The castle's fires burned warm, Christmas decorations would soon appear in the Great Hall, and students would head home for the holidays carrying contraband fever fudge and trick wands in their trunks. Fred and George would return after the break to continue their work, to keep building toward a future that seemed less impossible with every passing day. The dream of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was no longer just a whispered conversation by the common room fire. It was becoming real, one perfectly calibrated nosebleed nougat at a time. In the workshop, their cauldrons sat ready for the next experiment. The blackboard held equations and sketches for new products yet to be invented. And somewhere in all of it was the promise that creativity and determination could transform two troublemaking students into something more. They just had to keep working, keep believing, and keep making people laugh. Winter released its grip on Hogwarts slowly, reluctantly, like a cat being removed from a comfortable lap. The snow melted into slush, then into mud, then finally into the first tentative green shoots of spring. By March, the grounds were alive again with colour and sound. Students spreading out across the lawns during their free periods, the giant squid surfacing in the lake to enjoy the warmer water, and the forbidden forest rustling with creatures emerging from hibernation. Fred and George entered the spring term of their 6th year with a confidence they'd never possessed before. Their marks remained respectable, not brilliant, but solid enough to keep McGonagall from looking disappointed and their mother from sending howlers. More importantly, their business was thriving. The skiving snack boxes had become legendary. Every Gryffindor knew where to find the twins if they needed to escape a particularly dreadful lesson. Word had spread to Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw through carefully cultivated contacts. Even a few brave Slytherins had approached them, though those transactions happened in neutral territory with the wariness of nations negotiating treaties. But it was the trick ones that had truly captured everyone's imagination. The problem, Fred said one evening in their workshop, examining their latest creation, is consistency. Some ones transform every 3rd spell. Others wait until the 20th. There's no pattern. George was testing a wand himself, pointing it at a cushion they'd transfigured specifically for target practice. Incendio, he said clearly. The wand produced a perfectly normal flame. He tried again, still normal. On the 3rd attempt, the wand transformed into a large rubber chicken that let out an indignant squawk before returning to wooden form, the flame spell fizzling entirely. We need to understand why, George said, setting the wand down carefully. Is it the wand's core? The wood? The specific charm layering? They'd been studying wand lore obsessively for months now, reading everything from Ollivander's notes on wand cores to obscure texts on magical wood properties. What they'd learned was humbling. Wand making was perhaps the most complex magical discipline in existence, requiring years of study and innate talent. They weren't trying to make real wands. They knew better than that. But understanding how wands worked was essential to making them malfunction in amusing ways. It's the intention, Fred said suddenly, struck by inspiration. Wands respond to wizard intent, right? They're conduits for our magic. So maybe the inconsistency is because every wizard who uses a trick wand has different intent, different magical signatures. George caught on immediately. So we need to create a charm that triggers based on something consistent. Not the wizard's power or intention, but something else. Something measurable. They worked late into the night, testing theories. What if the transformation triggered based on the spell's complexity? No, too unpredictable. Based on the amount of magic channeled through the wand. Closer, but still inconsistent. Based on time elapsed since the previous spell. That had promise. It was nearly midnight when they achieved their breakthrough. Temporis gradus, George murmured, his wand tracing an intricate pattern over their test wand. Transformare tertio. The charm was elegantly simple once they'd figured it out. The wand would count spellcastings and transform on every 3rd use, not based on power or complexity, but pure arithmetic. 3 spells, transformation, 3 more. Transformation again. Predictable enough to be reliable, unpredictable enough to be surprising. Fred tested it immediately. First spell, a successful levitation charm. Second spell, successful again. Third spell, the wand turned into a tin parrot mid-incantation, and he dropped it in surprise. Perfect, George breathed. Absolutely perfect. They refined the charm over the following week, creating variations. Some wands transformed every third spell, others every fifth, others at random intervals between 3 and 7. The variety meant that even students who bought multiple wands wouldn't know exactly when the transformation would occur. The real test came during a particularly dull transfiguration lesson. Fred had given a trick wand to Kenneth Towler, their dorm mate, who'd been complaining about McGonagall's increasingly difficult assignments. Kenneth knew it was a trick wand. That was part of the appeal, but not exactly when it would activate. McGonagall was demonstrating the proper wand movement for turning a beetle into a button, her movements precise and practiced. The key is the initial flick combined with a smooth downward arc, like so. Now, Mr. Towler, please demonstrate. Kenneth stood, looking slightly nervous under McGonagall's sharp gaze. He pointed his wand at the beetle on his desk. Mutatio vestitus, he said clearly, executing a perfect wand movement. The wand transformed into a large rubber duck. The classroom exploded with laughter. Kenneth stood frozen, holding a bright yellow rubber duck that was squeaking indignantly in his grip. Even McGonagall's lips twitched, though she quickly compressed them into a stern line. Mr. Towler, she said, her voice carefully controlled. While I appreciate that you somehow acquired one of the Weasley Twins' creations, perhaps you might save such entertainment for your free time. Kenneth had gone bright red, but he was grinning. Yes, Professor. Sorry, Professor. The wand returned to normal, and Kenneth successfully transfigured his beetle on the second attempt. But the damage was done. Everyone in the class was buzzing about the trick wand, and by dinner, Fred and George had received 15 new orders. We need to increase production, George said that evening, surveying their dwindling stock of second-hand wands. We've got 12 wands left, and we've just taken orders for 30. The Hogsmeade weekend is in 2 days, Fred calculated. We can buy more wands then. But George, we're running out of space in the dormitory for storing galleons. The sock is literally overflowing. It was true. Their initial hiding place had become inadequate. They now had 3 socks, stuffed full of coins hidden in various locations around the dormitory, under mattresses, in the backs of drawers, inside hollowed-out textbooks that no one would ever voluntarily open. We need to count it properly, George said. Figure out exactly how much we have. They waited until their roommates were asleep, then carefully retrieved all 3 socks and emptied them onto Fred's bed, casting a silencing charm around the curtains to muffle the clinking of coins. The count took 20 minutes. 147 galleons, Fred whispered, staring at the pile of gold that gleamed in their wand light. 16 sickles and 8 nuts. George, that's more money than we've ever had in our lives. George finished, looking stunned. That's more than Dad makes in a month at the ministry. They sat there in the muffled darkness, surrounded by the physical proof of their success. 147 galleons earned from making people laugh, from creating products that brought joy and freedom and a bit of harmless mischief into the rigid structure of Hogwarts life. "We could actually do this," Fred said quietly. "Not just as a dream, but for real. After we graduate, we could open a shop." George was silent for a long moment. "We'd need more than this. A lot more. Rent, stock, business permits, renovation costs. A shop in Diagon Alley would cost thousands of galleons." "So we save," Fred said, feeling determination settle into his bones. "We've got a year and a half until graduation. If we can make 147 galleons in 5 months, we could have close to 500 by the time we leave Hogwarts. Maybe more if we expand our product line. Mum would have a fit." "Mum has fits regularly. We'll deal with that when we get there." They returned the galleons to their hiding places, now using 4 socks to distribute the weight, and lay in their beds, too excited to sleep despite the late hour. The next morning brought a complication they hadn't anticipated. Professor Flitwick pulled them aside after Charms class, his expression uncharacteristically serious. The tiny professor gestured for them to follow him to his office, a cluttered space filled with books on spellwork and magical theory stacked on every available surface. "Sit, sit," Flitwick squeaked, climbing onto his own specially heightened chair. "Now then, I've been hearing some interesting rumors about certain products being circulated among students." Fred and George exchanged glances. They'd been careful, so careful. No sales to students who might tell professors, no obvious transactions, always claiming that anything found was just a prototype or borrowed from Zonkos. Flitwick studied them both, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not here to punish you," he said, surprising them both. "I'm here because I'm curious. These trick wands that students keep accidentally using in class, they're quite sophisticated pieces of magic. The charm work required to make a wand temporarily transform while maintaining its structural integrity is NEWT level at minimum." "We've been studying wand law, sir," George offered carefully. "It's fascinating stuff." "Indeed it is," Flitwick agreed. "And the precision required to layer transformation charms in such a way that they activate predictably, but not dangerously. That's impressive work. Tell me, how did you solve the problem of maintaining the wand's core stability during transformation?" Despite their nervousness, Fred found himself drawn into the conversation. This was Flitwick, genuinely interested in their magical process, not as a professor catching students breaking rules, but as a fellow magic enthusiast appreciating clever spell work. "We used a stabilizing charm woven into the base layer," Fred explained, pulling out a piece of parchment and sketching the charm structure. "See, the transformation only affects the outer appearance and texture. The core remains intact, so the wand's fundamental magical properties aren't disrupted." Flitwick examined the sketch, his eyes brightening. "Brilliant. And the trigger mechanism? You're using a counting charm rather than responding to magical output levels. Much more reliable. Did you develop this yourselves?" "We consulted a lot of books, sir," George said. "But yes, the final solution was ours." The charms professor was quiet for a moment, studying them both with an expression that reminded Fred uncomfortably of Dumbledore. That sense of seeing far more than what was visible on the surface. "I won't report you," Flitwick said finally. "What you're doing is technically against school rules, selling products to fellow students without authorization. However, you're also demonstrating genuine magical innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. These are qualities that shouldn't be discouraged, merely guided. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more serious. But I must insist on 2 conditions. First, you ensure that everything you create is safe. No products that could cause lasting harm or serious injury. Second, you continue to maintain your academic performance. If your marks slip again, as they did last year, I'll have no choice but to inform Professor McGonagall and your head of house about your extracurricular activities. Yes, sir, they chorused, relief flooding through them. Good. Now then, Flitwick's expression shifted into something almost mischievous. I don't suppose you've considered the application of protein charms to your products? I've been thinking about your skiving snack boxes. If you could create a master candy and several duplicates with a protein link, you could potentially control the activation timing remotely. They spent the next hour in deep discussion of magical theory, with Flitwick offering suggestions and the twins explaining their creative process. By the time they left his office, they had 3 new product ideas and a promise from Flitwick to accidentally leave certain advanced spell books in the library where they might happen to find them. That, George said as they walked back to Gryffindor Tower, was unexpected. He basically gave us permission to keep working, Fred said, still slightly stunned. As long as we're safe and keep our marks up. And he gave us new ideas. Did you hear what he said about layering disillusionment charms into candy? We could make fainting fancies that also make you temporarily invisible. They returned to their workshop that evening with renewed energy, Flitwick's suggestions sparking a cascade of possibilities. The conversation had reminded them that what they were doing wasn't just rule-breaking or money-making. It was genuine magical innovation, the kind that required creativity and skill and deep understanding of how magic worked. Over the following weeks, they refined their trick wand production process, creating a system that allowed them to produce 10 wands per week while maintaining quality. They experimented with new transformations, wands that turned into singing canaries, into licorice whips, into small fireworks that spelled out rude words before dissipating harmlessly. Each variation sold immediately. Students came to them with specific requests. Can you make one that turns into a quill? I want to prank my doormate. What about one that produces flower petals? Could you do one that plays music? They took commissions when they could, charging extra for custom work. The galleons accumulated steadily, filling socks and then eventually requiring a small lockbox that George transfigured from an old tin and secured with password charms. By the end of April, as the castle prepared for the chaos of OWL and NEWT examinations, they had expanded their product line to include not just skiving snack boxes and trick wands, but also headless hats, which made the wearer appear headless, edible dark marks, which floated above dinner tables causing appropriate screams before being revealed as licorice, and extendable ears, their most complex creation yet, allowing users to eavesdrop from a distance. Their lockbox contained 238 galleons. We're doing it, George said one evening, looking around their workshop with something like awe. We're actually building a business while still at school. Fred nodded, feeling that familiar spark of determination mixed with joy. They were still students, still had to attend classes, complete homework, deal with professors and examinations, and all the tedious parts of Hogwarts life. But they were also inventors, entrepreneurs, creators of magic that made people happy. The dream of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes felt less like a fantasy and more like an inevitability. Every product they perfected, every galleon they earned, every satisfied customer who came back for more, it all built toward a future where they could make this their lives, not just their hobby. Outside, spring advanced toward summer, and the castle buzzed with the energy of approaching examinations. But in their 7th floor workshop, 2 red-haired twins worked late into the night, creating magic one trick wand at a time, building something that would outlast their years at Hogwarts and transform 2 troublemakers into something the wizarding world had never quite seen before. The future was bright, colorful, and filled with the promise of laughter. They just had to keep reaching for it. The summer between 6th and 7th year should have been glorious. Fred and George returned to the Burrow with their end-of-year marks. Respectable exceeds expectations across most subjects, a few acceptables in the more tedious ones, and a lockbox containing 293 galleons hidden in the false bottom of Fred's trunk, secured with charms that would make even Gringotts goblins nod in approval. Instead, the summer felt like walking on eggshells that had been scattered across a minefield. Their mother was in one of her moods, the kind where everything the twins did was interpreted as evidence of imminent failure or moral decay. They couldn't work on product development because she'd demand to know what they were doing. They couldn't discuss business plans because she'd lecture them about getting proper jobs at the ministry, like their father. They couldn't even sketch ideas in their room because Percy, home for the summer and unbearable about his new position at the ministry, kept barging in unannounced. "You need to think about your futures," Molly Weasley announced at dinner one evening in July, her tone suggesting this was a conversation they'd been avoiding rather than one she was forcing upon them. "You'll be graduating in less than a year. Have you thought about career counseling? What you might do after Hogwarts?" "We've thought about it, Mum," Fred said carefully, moving peas around his plate. And she looked between them expectantly, her expression already showing signs of the disapproval that would follow whatever answer they gave. "We're still considering options," George offered diplomatically. Percy snorted from across the table. "Still considering options? You should have career plans finalized by now. When I was in 7th year, I had already applied to 3 different ministry departments and received internship offers from 2 of them." "Yes, thank you, Percy," Fred muttered. "We're aware of your achievements. You mention them roughly 17 times per day." "Don't take that tone with your brother," Molly snapped. "Percy is trying to help. You could both learn from his example. Dedication, proper career planning, respect for authority." "We're not Percy," George said, his voice tight. "We're never gonna be." "Percy." The table fell silent, except for the sound of Ron trying to hide a snicker behind his napkin and Ginny kicking him under the table to shut him up. Arthur Weasley cleared his throat diplomatically. "Now, I'm sure the boys have plenty of time to figure things out. They're bright lads. They'll find their way. That's exactly the problem." Molly's voice was rising now. "They're bright, but they waste it on pranks and nonsense. They could have respectable careers, but instead they spend all their time on ridiculous jokes. Fred and George exchanged glances and, by unspoken agreement, excused themselves from the table before the lecture could gain momentum. They retreated to their room at the top of the burrow, where the ceiling sloped at odd angles and their beds were crammed in among stacks of product prototypes they'd smuggled home. Fred locked the door and cast a silencing charm, while George pulled out their lockbox, entering the password, Wheezes. The box opened to reveal neat stacks of galleons they'd organized by denomination. 293 galleons. It was more money than their father made in 3 months, earned entirely through their own creativity and hard work. "We can't tell them," Fred said, quietly. "Not yet." They wouldn't understand. George nodded, tracing patterns in the worn wood of the box lid. Mum would have a fit. She'd probably make us donate it all to charity or save it for sensible things like house deposits and ministry robes. "The dream doesn't feel as impossible anymore, does it?" Fred asked, voicing what they'd both been thinking. "With what we've saved, plus what we could make in our final year, we might actually have enough to start small. Rent a tiny shop, stock it with our best products, see if we can make it work." "We'd need more than this," George said practically, though his eyes were bright with the same hope Fred felt. Rent in Diagon Alley would eat through these galleons in months. We'd need enough for at least a year, maybe 2, to establish ourselves before we turn a profit. They spent the evening doing calculations, sketching business plans in their carefully spelled notebooks that no one else could read. Startup costs, monthly expenses, projected income, growth strategies. It was the same kind of focus they'd once given to perfecting Nosebleed Nougat, but now applied to the larger dream. The summer dragged on with painful slowness. They helped with chores, endured lectures, avoided conversations about careers, and counted down the days until they could return to Hogwarts and their workshop. When September finally arrived, they boarded the Hogwarts Express with relief so profound it was almost physical. The castle welcomed them back like an old friend. 7th year at Hogwarts carried a certain weight. The awareness that this was the last year, the final chance to experience the magic and madness of school life before being thrust into the adult world. The younger students looked at 7th years with a mixture of respect and envy. The professors looked at them with expectation, already calculating NEWT predictions. Fred and George looked at it as their final year to build momentum for what came next. Their workshop had remained undisturbed over the summer, protected by the charms they'd layered on the door and the general obscurity of their 7th floor corridor. They spent their first weekend back cleaning and restocking, reviewing their product inventory, planning their production schedule for the year. "We need to be smart about this," George said, organizing their ingredient jars by category. "It's NEWT year. McGonagall will be watching us like a hawk. We can't let our marks slip." "Agreed," Fred said, "but we also can't waste this opportunity. This is our last year to build up capital before we need to actually launch. Every galleon we make now is a galleon we don't need to borrow later." They settled into a rhythm. Attend classes diligently, complete homework on time, and spend every spare moment in the workshop. Their NEWT level coursework was actually useful now. Potions taught them ingredient interactions that improved their skiving snack boxes. Charms expanded their understanding of how to make trick wands more reliable. Even transfiguration helped them understand the principles behind their transformation-based products. The business thrived. Word of their products had spread over the summer through letters and gossip, and students returned to Hogwarts with lists of things they wanted to buy. By October, they'd added another 70 galleons to their logbox. Then, on a crisp Saturday in late October, everything changed. They were in the library, actually studying, not just pretending, when Harry Potter approached their table with an expression that suggested he was about to do something either very brave or very stupid. "Fred, George," Harry said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Can I talk to you? Somewhere private." They followed him to an empty classroom on the 3rd floor, curiosity warring with concern. Harry was family, in the complicated way that family extended beyond blood in the Weasley household. Ron's best friend, Ginny's crush, the boy who'd somehow defeated Voldemort as an infant and now bore the weight of everyone's expectations. "What's wrong?" Fred asked, noting the tension in Harry's shoulders. Harry closed the door and cast a quick Muffliato charm. 5th year Harry had learned some useful magic. Then he turned to face them, his expression serious. "I want to invest in your business." The twins stared at him. Of all the things they'd expected Harry to say, this ranked somewhere below "I'm secretly a werewolf" and "I've decided to join the Slytherin Quidditch team." "What?" George said eloquently. Harry pulled out a small pouch from his robes, setting it on a nearby desk with a heavy clink. "The Triwizard Tournament winnings. 1,000 galleons. I want you to have it." Fred's mind had gone blank. 1,000 galleons. 1,000. That was more than triple what they'd saved through a year and a half of careful sales and production. That was enough to actually, genuinely rent a shop in Diagon Alley and stock it properly. "Harry," Fred said slowly, "that's your money. Your prize for surviving." He stopped, remembering Cedric Diggory, the graveyard, the horror of that tournament's ending. "You earned that. You shouldn't just give it away." "I'm not giving it away," Harry said firmly. "I'm investing it. You two are building something real. I've seen your products. Half the school uses them. The extendable ears are brilliant. The skiving snack boxes actually work. You're going to open a shop after graduation, right?" "That's the plan," George admitted. "Eventually, when we have enough capital saved." "So let me help," Harry said. "I don't need the money. It's been sitting in my vault for over a year, and every time I think about it, I remember." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I remember how I got it. But if that money could help you build something that makes people laugh, that brings joy instead of whatever the tournament brought, then maybe it would mean something good." The twins looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that only they could manage. 1,000 galleons was life-changing. It was the difference between hoping to open a shop and knowing they could. It was security, opportunity, the chance to actually succeed rather than just survive. But it was also terrifying. Taking Harry's money meant accepting responsibility not just to themselves, but to him. It meant this had to work, because failure would mean losing not just their own savings, but their friends' trust. "Harry," Fred said carefully, "if we take this, we're not just playing around anymore. This becomes real, a real business with real stakes. And if we fail—" "You won't fail," Harry interrupted. "I've watched you for years. When you two decide to do something, it happens. You made a map show you everything in the castle. You created candy that convinces Madame Pomfrey people are genuinely ill. You've built something while still at school that most adult wizards couldn't manage. You won't fail. George picked up the pouch, feeling its weight. Inside were gold galleons that represented more than money. They represented belief, trust, and the chance to turn their dream into reality. We'd need to do this properly, George said slowly. Draw up an agreement, make you a proper investor. You'd own a percentage of the business. Harry shook his head. I don't want ownership. Just take it as a loan if that makes you feel better. Pay me back when you can or don't. I don't care. I just want to help. We're paying you back, Fred said firmly, with interest. And you're getting free products for life. Both of those things are non-negotiable. Harry grinned, and for a moment, he looked less like the boy who lived and more like just Harry, their brother Ron's best friend, who'd survived too much too young and just wanted to help people he cared about succeed. Deal, Harry said, extending his hand. They shook on it, the three of them standing in that empty classroom, while outside the castle went about its Saturday afternoon routines. Students studied in the library. Quidditch teams practiced on the pitch. Professors marked essays in their offices. Normal Hogwarts life, continuing as it always did. But for Fred and George, everything had just fundamentally changed. That evening, they sat in their workshop with the pouch of galleons spread across their workbench. Combined with their own savings, they now had 1,363 galleons. Real money. Start a business money. We have to make this work, Fred said quietly. Not just for us anymore. For Harry. George nodded, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that meant he was thinking hard. We need a proper business plan, not just sketches and calculations, but real projections. We need to figure out rent costs, licensing fees, renovation expenses. We need to know exactly how many products we need to sell each month to break even. They worked through the night, creating documents that looked almost professional. They researched Diagon Alley shop rents through back issues of the Daily Profits commercial section in the library. They calculated production costs for each of their products, factoring in ingredients, time, and packaging. They projected sales based on their Hogwarts experience, but adjusted conservatively for a broader market. By dawn, they had a plan. A real, viable business plan that showed how two recent Hogwarts graduates could rent a small shop, stock it with innovative products, and potentially turn a profit within the first year. It was ambitious. It was risky. It required them to work harder than they'd ever worked before and to maintain that effort while completing their NEWTS. But it was possible. Actually, genuinely possible. We're really doing this, George said as the sun rose over the castle, painting their workshop in shades of gold and pink. We're really doing this, Fred agreed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of productivity. They increased production, creating stockpiles of their best products to sell at Hogwarts while building inventory for their future shop. They refined formulas, improved packaging, and started designing a logo, a stylized W with small explosions radiating from it, colorful and chaotic and perfectly them. Their NEWT coursework continued, but now it felt purposeful rather than obligatory. Every spell they mastered was a tool they could use in product development. Every potion principle they learned improved their skiving snack boxes. They weren't studying to pass examinations. They were studying to build a business. Professor Flitwick, noticing their renewed focus, pulled them aside after charms one day. "You two seem particularly motivated this term," he observed, his eyes twinkling. "May I assume your entrepreneurial ventures are progressing well?" "You could say that, sir," Fred said carefully. Good. Remember what I told you. Safety first, and maintain your marks. But between you and me," Flitwick glanced around, conspiratorially, "the wizarding world could use more innovators and fewer bureaucrats. If you're planning what I think you're planning, I wish you the very best of luck." It was as close to an endorsement as they'd ever received from a professor, and it meant more than they could articulate. By December, their lockbox required expansion charms to hold all the galleons. They'd added another 200 to their total through steady sales, bringing them to over 1,500 galleons. More importantly, they'd perfected their entire product line and created detailed production manuals so they could replicate everything efficiently once they had a proper workshop. The dream was taking shape, becoming solid and real in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. They couldn't tell their mother, not yet. Molly Weasley's vision for her son's futures didn't include joke shops and prank products. She imagined them in respectable ministry positions, wearing proper robes, advancing through proper career paths. The conversation about their real plans would have to wait until after graduation, when it was too late for her to stop them. But they told each other, late at night in their workshop, speaking their hopes and plans into existence. "Purple and orange," Fred said, designing their shopfront on parchment. "Bright, bold, impossible to miss. We want people to see it from the street and feel curious." "Shelves, floor to ceiling," George added. "Everything visible, everything accessible. We want customers to explore, to discover things they didn't know they needed. A testing area where people can try products before buying. We'll have to supervise it, make sure no one overdoses on fever fudge, but it'll be worth it. And in the back, a proper workshop, twice the size of this one. Proper ventilation charms, better cauldrons, enough space to really experiment." They planned until their candles burned low and the castle fell silent around them. Two brothers building a future that most people would call impossible, foolish, a waste of their education. But it was their future, built from their imagination and their effort and their stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly who they were. In his dormitory, several floors below, Harry Potter lay awake, thinking about the twins and the money he'd given them. He didn't regret it, not for a moment. The tournament winnings had felt cursed, tainted by everything that had happened. But now, that money would create something good, something bright and joyful. And in the headmaster's office, Albus Dumbledore sat reading reports from his professors, noting with interest that the Weasley Twins' marks had remained consistently high all term, despite rumors of increased entrepreneurial activity. He smiled slightly, remembering other students over the decades who'd used their Hogwarts years to build futures that existed outside traditional paths. Not every kind of magic required a wand. Some magic was born from creativity, determination, and the courage to reach for dreams that seemed impossible. The twins were creating that kind of magic, one product at a time, one galleon at a time, one step closer to a future, bright with color and laughter. They just had to keep believing, keep working, and keep reaching for the impossible until it became inevitable. June arrived at Hogwarts with the weight of finality. This was it. The last month. The last examinations. The last time they'd walk these corridors as students. The castle seemed to sense the approaching end, the portraits more melancholy than usual, the ghosts drifting through their territories with something like nostalgia. Fred and George should have been focused entirely on their NEWTS. Instead, they were planning an exit. "It has to be spectacular," Fred said one evening in their workshop, which had become less a laboratory and more a war room covered in business plans and architectural sketches. "We're not just leaving school, we're launching a business. People need to remember us." George was reviewing their inventory lists for the 100th time. "We have enough stock for the initial shop opening. 15 dozen skiving snack boxes in all varieties, 40 trick wands with different transformations, 30 headless hats, 100 sets of extendable ears, and 50 of the new portable swamps." The portable swamps were their latest creation, a product that could turn any corridor or room into an instant marshland, complete with frogs and cattails and sucking mud. They tested it once in an abandoned bathroom, and it had taken 3 professors and half a day to clean up. Perfect for their purposes. "The lease on the Diagon Alley shop is signed," Fred said, consulting their carefully organized folder of business documents. "Number 93, Diagon Alley. Small, but perfectly located between Flourish and Blotts and the apothecary. High foot traffic, reasonable rent. We can move in July 1st. They'd found the shop through a combination of luck and determination. A small, narrow building that had been vacant for 2 years, its previous owner having retired to the coast. The rent was manageable with their capital, and the location was ideal for catching Hogwarts students shopping for school supplies. The landlord, an elderly wizard named Archibald Pennyfold, who smelled perpetually of pipe smoke and had seen bemused by 2 17-year-olds wanting to rent commercial property, had asked pointed questions about their business model and financial backing. They'd showed him their calculations, their product samples, and Harry's investment letter, carefully worded to sound more impressive than "my friend gave me money." Pennyfold had been skeptical, but ultimately practical. Their gold was as good as anyone's. "Have you thought about what we're going to tell Mum?" George asked, voicing the concern that had been hovering over them for weeks. Fred grimaced. That was the conversation he was dreading more than any NEWT examination. "We tell her after we've already done it. After we've left Hogwarts. After we've moved into the shop. After it's too late for her to stop us. She's going to be furious. She's going to be apocalyptic," Fred corrected. "But she'll also eventually see that we're serious, that we've planned this properly, and that we're capable of making it work. Probably. Hopefully." Maybe George didn't look convinced, but they had bigger concerns at the moment. The NEWTS loomed. Those final examinations that supposedly determined their entire futures. The irony wasn't lost on them that they were about to deliberately sabotage examinations while simultaneously ensuring they'd passed enough to satisfy their mother's minimum expectations. They needed to leave Hogwarts, but they needed to leave with enough academic credentials that their family wouldn't completely disown them. The first week of NEWTS passed in a blur of practical demonstrations and theoretical examinations. Charms went well. Flitwick had been their ally all year, and they genuinely understood the material. Transfiguration was acceptable, though McGonagall's lips had thinned when Fred's conjured owl had been slightly lopsided. Potions was predictably tense under Snape's cold gaze, but they'd brewed competent draft of peace samples and escaped without disaster. Defense against the dark arts was interesting. The current professor seemed impressed by their practical spell work, particularly when they demonstrated a shield charm strong enough to deflect 3 simultaneous stunners. They were on track to pass with decent marks. Not spectacular, not Percy level, but respectable enough. Then came the day they'd been planning for months. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and warm, the kind of day when Hogwarts looked like something from a painting. Students were scattered across the grounds, some studying for remaining examinations, others simply enjoying the sunshine and the approaching end of term. Fred and George walked through the castle one last time as students, their bags packed with carefully selected inventory. They'd said goodbye to their workshop the previous night, vanishing any remaining traces of their work, leaving the room as empty and dusty as they'd found it years ago. Someone else might discover it someday and wonder what it had been used for. They found the perfect spot, the 5th floor corridor that connected the main staircase to the east wing, heavily trafficked and wide enough for their purposes. Students would be passing through all morning, heading to examinations or the library or breakfast ready. George asked, pulling out a small purple sphere about the size of a snitch. Ready? Fred confirmed, his heart pounding with excitement and nerves and the kind of reckless joy that had defined their entire Hogwarts career. George placed the portable swamp on the floor and tapped it once with his wand. Expansio Palus. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sphere began to glow, pulsing with internal light. It rolled slowly across the stone floor, leaving a trail of moisture behind it. The moisture spread, darkened, became mud. The mud deepened, began to bubble, and then the corridor exploded into chaos. A swamp erupted from the single sphere, spreading with impossible speed across the entire 5th floor corridor. Mud sucked at the stone floors, cattails sprouted from nothing. Lily pads appeared on pools of murky water. Frogs materialized, croaking with enthusiastic volume. A heron stood in the shallows, looking confused but committed to its role. Students screamed, some in alarm, most in delight. A group of 3rd years attempting to cross the corridor found themselves knee-deep in mud, their school robes splattered brown. A prefect tried to vanish the swamp with a spell, but it simply regenerated around him. What is going on here? Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the noise as she arrived, her robes billowing dramatically. She stopped at the edge of the swamp, her expression cycling through shock, fury, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. Fred and George stood at the corridor's opposite end, clearly visible and making no attempt to hide. "Sorry, Professor," Fred called cheerfully. "We seem to have had a slight accident with one of our products." "An accident," McGonagall repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "An accident that has turned an entire corridor into a swamp during NEWT examinations." "Terrible timing," George agreed. "We should probably be going, actually. Don't want to miss our herbology practical." "You will do no such thing." McGonagall's voice could have stripped paint from walls. "You will reverse this immediately, serve detention for the remainder of term, and—" "Actually, Professor," Fred interrupted, "we can't reverse it. Portable swamps are designed to be permanent unless properly dispelled, and we specifically created this one to resist standard vanishing charms. You'll probably need to bring in a specialist. Might take a few days, maybe a week." McGonagall's expression had progressed beyond fury into something transcendent. "You deliberately created a product that cannot be easily removed, and then deployed it in my school." "Yes, Professor," they chorused. Students were gathering now, watching the confrontation with the fascination usually reserved for Quidditch matches. Even other professors were arriving, Flitwick looking concerned, Snape looking coldly furious, Sprout examining the plant life with professional interest. 10 points from Gryffindor," McGonagall snapped. "Each! And detention for—" "Actually, you know what? I'm not going to bother with detention. You're both expelled. Effective immediately. Collect your belongings and leave the castle." There was a collective gasp from the watching students. Expulsion was rare, serious, the kind of punishment that followed you forever. Fred and George exchanged glances and grinned. "Understood, Professor," Fred said. "We'll just be going then." They turned to leave, but McGonagall's voice stopped them. "Wait, you're not upset? Being expelled is serious. It goes on your permanent record. It affects your future employment prospects." "We know, Professor," George said, turning back to face her. "But here's the thing. We don't need Hogwarts credentials anymore. We have something better." Fred pulled out a small card from his pocket, handing it to McGonagall with a flourish. It was their business card, freshly printed. "Weasleys Wizard Wheezes, for all your deflagration needs. Opening July 1st, number 93, Diagon Alley." McGonagall stared at the card, her expression shifting from anger to confusion to something that might have been understanding. "You're opening a shop?" "We are," Fred confirmed. "We've been planning it for 3 years. We have capital, inventory, a lease, and a business plan. Hogwarts was our laboratory. Now we're ready for the real world." "So, you see," George continued, "expulsion is actually convenient. Saves us from having to sit through the rest of our examinations when we've already passed enough to satisfy our mum's minimum requirements." The watching crowd was murmuring now, some students looking impressed, others shocked. Professor Flitwick was smiling openly, his small face bright with pleasure. Even Snape looked grudgingly intrigued, despite his best efforts to maintain his scowl. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, studying them both with those sharp eyes that had seen through their schemes since they were 11 years old. "You planned this," she said finally. "The swamp, the expulsion, the dramatic exit. You planned all of it." "Yes, Professor," they admitted. "And you believe you can succeed in running a business at 17 years old, with no adult guidance and no safety net?" "We know we can," Fred said firmly. "We've been doing it here for 2 years. Now we're just making it official." McGonagall shook her head slowly, but something in her expression had softened. "You two have been the bane of my existence since you first walked into my classroom. You've disrupted lessons, exploded cauldrons, turned corridors into swamps." She gestured at the chaos around them, "and generally made my life significantly more difficult." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "You've also been two of the most naturally talented students I've had the privilege to teach. Your transfiguration work, when you bothered to focus, was exceptional. Your creativity and innovation in spellwork rivals some professional curse breakers, and your determination to succeed at something you genuinely cared about has been, despite everything, rather inspiring. Fred felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He hadn't realized how much he'd wanted her approval, her acknowledgement that they were more than just troublemakers. "I cannot condone what you've done here," McGonagall continued, her tone becoming stern again. "The swamp stays on your record as the reason for expulsion. However," she reached into her robes and pulled out a small card, pressing it into Fred's hand. "If you're going to insist on this madness, at least do it properly. This is the contact information for my nephew. He's a commercial solicitor who specializes in small business law. Tell him I sent you. He'll help ensure you don't accidentally break any ministry regulations." Fred stared at the card, then at McGonagall, then at the card again. "Professor, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said crisply. "Thank me in 5 years if you're still in business and haven't bankrupted yourselves. Now get out of my castle before I change my mind about helping you." They left Hogwarts that afternoon with their trunks packed, their inventory carefully shrunken and stored, and a send-off that would become legendary in school history. Students lined the entrance hall, cheering as they passed. Lee Jordan had somehow procured fireworks that spelled out Weasleys Wizard Wheezes in purple smoke. Even some of the professors nodded respectfully as they walked by. The 5th floor swamp remained for 3 weeks, becoming a bizarre tourist attraction within the school. Students posed for photographs beside it. Younger years used it to practice wading charms, and Professor Sprout gave an impromptu lecture on magical ecosystem development. By the time it was finally removed, the twins' legend was secure. Diagon Alley in late June was bustling with activity. Witches and wizards shopping for summer supplies, families gathering ingredients for potions, children pressing their faces against shop windows, dreaming of brooms they couldn't afford. Number 93 was a narrow building squeezed between larger shops, 3 stories tall and currently looking rather shabby with its peeling purple paint and dusty windows. But to Fred and George, standing before it with their entire futures packed into a few trunks, it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. "Our shop," George said softly. "Our shop," Fred agreed. They spent 2 weeks in a frenzy of renovation. They couldn't afford professional help, so they did everything themselves, painting the exterior in eye-catching purple and orange, installing shelving that climbed to the ceiling, creating display cases for their most impressive products. They enchanted the front windows to show rotating demonstrations of their wares, skiving snack boxes, cycling through their effects, trick wands transforming, headless hats making mannequins appear decapitated. The workshop in the back was twice the size of their Hogwarts space, with proper ventilation, quality cauldrons, and enough room to actually work comfortably. They set up production lines, organized ingredients, and began manufacturing stock to supplement what they'd brought from school. Harry visited during the preparations, taking one look at the organized chaos and grinning widely. "It's brilliant," he said simply. "Absolutely brilliant. Couldn't have done it without you," Fred told him. "Seriously. We mean that, I know," Harry said. "But you would have found a way eventually. I just helped you get here faster." They worked 18-hour days, surviving on sandwiches and tea, and the kind of manic energy that came from building something from nothing. George designed the signage, a huge purple sign with Weasleys Wizard Wheezes in orange letters that practically glowed, visible from halfway down the street. Fred organized their inventory system, creating a magical catalog that tracked stock levels and automatically reordered ingredients when supplies ran low. The conversation with their mother happened exactly as badly as expected. Molly Weasley's howler arrived 3 days after they'd been expelled, and it was spectacular even by her standards. The red envelope exploded in the shop in progress, and her magically magnified voice shook the windows. Expelled! Expelled from Hogwarts! Do you have any idea what you've done? Your father and I are ashamed. Opening a joke shop instead of getting proper employment. Wasting your education. When you come home, Fred vanished the howler before he could finish cutting off mid-thread. We're not going home, he said quietly to George, who looked slightly shell-shocked. Not for a while. We'll write to Dad, explain everything properly. Eventually, Mum will calm down. Probably the follow-up letter to their father was difficult to write, but necessary. They explained the planning, the investment, the business model. They included their projections, their inventory lists, proof that this was a serious venture rather than a childish whim. Arthur's response came 2 days later. Not a howler, but a carefully worded letter that managed to convey both concern and cautious support. He would handle Molly, he promised. Give her time. As July approached, they put the finishing touches on the shop. The main floor was an explosion of color and chaos. Products displayed in deliberate disarray that was actually carefully organized to encourage exploration. A testing area was cordoned off with purple rope, supervised by enchanted signs warning about proper usage. The cash register was a modified adding machine that calculated change and kept running totals automatically. The workshop in back was pristine and organized, every ingredient labeled, every cauldron positioned perfectly. They'd even installed a small living area on the 3rd floor. 2 beds, a tiny kitchen, enough space to survive while they established the business. On June 30th, the evening before their official opening, they stood in their shop and just looked at what they'd built. The shelves full of products they'd invented, the displays showing off their creativity, the workshop where they'd continued developing new ideas. It was real, actually, impossibly real. Think anyone will come? George asked, voicing the fear they'd both been carrying. They'll come, Fred said, with more confidence than he felt. We're brilliant. Our products are brilliant. And tomorrow everyone's going to know it. They slept poorly that night, nerves and excitement keeping them awake. When dawn broke over Diagon Alley, they were already downstairs, making final adjustments, straightening displays that didn't need straightening, second-guessing price points that they'd calculated dozens of times. At precisely 9 o'clock, Fred unlocked the door to number 93 Diagon Alley, and Weasley's Wizard Wheezes opened for business. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. They stood behind the counter, trying not to look desperate, wondering if they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then a young witch paused outside, noticing their window display. She stepped inside, curious. Then another customer, then 3 more. Then suddenly the shop was full. Students recognizing them from Hogwarts, adults curious about the garish new shop, children dragging parents toward the exciting displays. Are these the real skiving snack boxes? a fourth-year Hufflepuff asked, eyes wide. The ones that actually work? Guaranteed all your money back, George promised, demonstrating with a sample nosebleed nougat. By noon, they'd sold 40 galleons worth of products. By closing time at 6, they'd sold over 100. The shop had been packed all day with customers exclaiming over products, testing samples, and spreading word to friends. Fred and George collapsed behind the counter after locking the door, staring at the till full of galleons and the depleted shelves. "We did it," George said, sounding dazed. "We actually did it," Fred agreed. Outside, Diagon Alley settled into evening quiet. Inside number 93, two 17-year-old twins who dropped out of school to chase an impossible dream counted their earnings and began planning tomorrow's production schedule. They had a business, they had customers, they had a future built from laughter and creativity, and the stubborn determination to be exactly who they were. The castle on the distant hill held their memories, late nights in a 7th-floor workshop, exploding cauldrons in dungeons, a swamp in a 5th-floor corridor. But this narrow shop in Diagon Alley held their future, bright with purple and orange paint, filled with products that made people laugh. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes wasn't just a shop. It was proof that creativity could be a career, that making people happy was serious work, and that two troublemakers from a cramped room at the top of the burrow could build something that mattered. They'd started with a spark, an accidental explosion in the common room, and a frustrated professor suggesting they take pranks seriously. They'd built it into fire, a workshop, products, capital, and dreams. Now they were watching it become something bigger than either of them had imagined. And this was only the beginning.